A novel was published in London on the 14th of May, 1925. It was 300 pages long. Almost nothing in it happens. A middle-aged woman, the wife of a Conservative member of Parliament, walks to a Bond Street florist to buy flowers for the party she is hosting that evening. She walks home. She mends a torn dress. She rests. She greets her old friend Peter Walsh, back unexpectedly from India. She holds her party. The party takes place. At the party, she hears, in passing, that a stranger she has never met, a young veteran of the First World War, has thrown himself out of a fourth-floor window that afternoon. She thinks briefly about his death. She returns to her party. The book ends. The whole novel takes place inside a single day in central London, a Wednesday in the middle of June. The novel was Mrs. Dalloway, and the small private revolution it accomplished over those 300 pages and those 24 hours was, by any literary measure, more violent than anything an entire generation of 19th-century English realism had been able to do. Mrs. Dalloway, in 1925, broke the way novels could be told. Almost everything modern fiction does that the 19th century did not: interior consciousness, time as subjective experience, the simultaneity of minds across a city. The refusal of a single central plot comes, in part, out of this small book. It was published in the same year as Fitzgerald's The Great Gatsby, the same year as Hemingway's In Our Time, the same year, 2 months later, as Kafka's The Trial. 1925 was the high-water year of the modernist revolution in prose. Mrs. Dalloway was, in that year, the central English contribution. What is Mrs. Dalloway actually doing? Here is the central technique. The novel is told in what later critics would call free indirect style, a mode of narration in which the third-person voice is constantly slipping into and out of the consciousness of whichever character is currently in the scene. The narrative voice is not the voice of any single character. It is not the voice of an external narrator. It is, instead, a fluid stream that moves between minds, picking up the inner thoughts of one person for a paragraph, then drifting across the street into the consciousness of another, then back. The reader is, throughout the novel, never quite sure whose mind they are inside. This is not confusion. It is the precise effect Woolf wanted. The point of the technique is that consciousness, in a city, is not a private possession. It is a shared atmosphere. We all walk down Bond Street together. We are all, while we walk, thinking partly our own thoughts and partly catching the thoughts of the people we pass. This is the great innovation. And it had not been done in English prose before Mrs. Dalloway. The book has on its surface almost no plot. But beneath that surface, the book is structured with extraordinary care. There are, in fact, 2 protagonists. Clarissa Dalloway is one. She is 52. She is upper middle class. She is recovering from a serious illness. She is married to a politician she respects, but does not love. She is preparing a party. The other protagonist is Septimus Warren Smith. He is 30. He is a veteran of the First World War. He is suffering from what the post-war doctors of 1925 called shell shock and what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. He has been ordered, by his wife and his doctors, to commit himself voluntarily to a country sanatorium for what would today be called involuntary psychiatric confinement. He cannot bear the prospect. At about 3 in the afternoon, he throws himself from the open window of his Bloomsbury lodgings onto the iron railings of the street below. He dies on the spot. Clarissa and Septimus never meet. They live, on the day of the novel, perhaps 2 miles apart in central London. They share no common acquaintance who would introduce them. They walk, at different points in the day, on the same streets, both, briefly, in Bond Street, both, briefly, in Bloomsbury Square, but they do not see each other. The only contact between them is at Clarissa's party that evening, when one of her guests, Sir William Bradshaw, the psychiatrist who had been treating Septimus and ordering his commitment, mentions in passing that a young man had killed himself that afternoon. This is the central architecture of the novel. The 2 consciousnesses are kept entirely apart. They never touch. And yet, by the end of the book, the reader has the strong sense that they are deeply connected, that Clarissa and Septimus are, In some way, Woolf is not quite willing to make explicit, mirror images of each other. He is the part of her that did not survive the war. She is the part of him that found a way to throw a party instead. The novel is held together by the connection that is never named. The technique is the meaning. You did not know this, but Woolf had originally intended Clarissa Dalloway to die at the end of the novel. In an early draft, hand-corrected in her notebook, the party is the occasion of Clarissa's suicide. She would, in this version, kill herself in her own house in the middle of the evening, surrounded by her guests. Woolf decided, late in the writing, against it. She decided that Septimus would die instead. She decided that Clarissa would, instead of dying, hear about his death and, at the central moment of the book, a small moment, in a small inner room of the house during the party, withdraw from her guests for a few minutes, sit alone with the news of Septimus's death and silently absorb it. The novel is held open by this transfer. The death is moved offstage. The party continues. Clarissa lives. This is, in the entire architecture of the modernist novel, one of the great structural decisions ever made. It is the decision that allowed Mrs. Dalloway to be a comedy of manners on its surface and a tragic novel about the First World War underneath. Without the original intention to kill Clarissa, the book would not have its weight. With the original intention left intact, the book would have been unreadable. Woolf split the protagonist in half. She gave the comedy to Clarissa and the tragedy to Septimus. She did so without ever letting them meet. But here's what that argument actually ignores. Mrs. Dalloway is, in many ways, the most autobiographical novel Woolf ever wrote. She had not yet, in 1925, attempted suicide. She had, throughout her 30s, lived with what we would now call recurrent bipolar disorder. She had, throughout the writing of Mrs. Dalloway, been intermittently unable to leave her own house. Septimus's experience of mental collapse, the way the world begins to speak to him in encoded messages, the way he hears the dead, the way the world becomes simultaneously brighter and farther away, is, by the testimony of Woolf's own diaries, an almost exact transcription of her own depressive episodes. The Sir William Bradshaw who would have committed Septimus to the country sanatorium was modeled, in part, on the famous Harley Street psychiatrist Sir George Savage, whose advice Woolf herself had been receiving for 15 years. The novel is, in its most unguarded reading, the story of how Virginia Woolf was, in 1925, managing to hold the line against her own breakdown by writing the breakdown out as a man. 16 years later, in March 1941, Virginia Woolf would walk into the River Ouse near her house in Sussex with stones in the pockets of her coat. She drowned. The death she had given to Septimus and refused to give to Clarissa would, eventually, come for her. The Mrs. Dalloway of the published novel Clarissa Lives, Clarissa Goes Back to Her Party, was, in the longer scale of Woolf's own life, an act of literary resistance against an ending that the writer herself, deep down, suspected was coming. What does Mrs. Dalloway actually mean today? Here is the third reading, the one that most contemporary criticism has settled on. The book is not really about a party. The book is not really about post-traumatic stress. The book is about the architecture of consciousness in a modern city. Mrs. Dalloway is the first English-language novel in which the city itself, London, is treated as a single distributed mind. The chiming of Big Ben every half hour throughout the day is not a clock telling the time. It is a binding tone that synchronizes the consciousnesses of the characters. They all hear it. They all, when it strikes, are pulled, for a moment, into the same time. The novel argues, structurally, that a city is held together by these small synchronizations, that no individual lives in their own consciousness, that we are all in everyone else's mind, all the time, whether or not we know it. This is why Mrs. Dalloway still matters. It is the first novel to take seriously the experience of urban life as a shared interior. It is the ancestor of every subsequent novel about a single day in a city, Joyce's Ulysses. In some sense, though Ulysses was published 3 years earlier, Ian McEwan's Saturday, Don DeLillo's Cosmopolis. None of them would exist in the same form without Woolf having shown the way. There is one image worth taking from the book. At the very center of the novel, in the early afternoon, An aeroplane is flying over central London, trailing smoke and skywriting. Everyone in the street is looking up. Each character tries to read what the aeroplane is spelling. Each character reads a different word. The actual word is an advertisement for toffee. Nobody can quite agree on what it says. They are all, briefly, looking at the same sky. They are all, briefly, in the same moment. They cannot agree what they are seeing. This is, in 2 paragraphs, the entire argument of Mrs. Dalloway. We share the sky. We do not share the meaning. The book is the small miracle of holding that contradiction open for 300 pages without ever resolving it. If this changed how you think about Virginia Woolf, subscribe. We break down the most important books ever written, one argument at a time. New video every week. And if this was worth 10 minutes of your life, hit like. It helps the channel more than you think.